We want to encourage and support local authors. And on that endeavor, we've got our speaker today, Dr. Jim Keating. We're in the initial stages of publishing a book that Jim has authored on the the economic development of Hancock County. So that being said, Jim is our speaker today. He's a prolific writer for the Historian, for the Seacoast Echo. Every week you can read a column in there, and of course every month in the Historian. So today Jim is going to talk to us about the history of Bay-Waveland Yacht Club. So Jim, thank you very much.
Can everybody hear me? Good. I'm Jim Keating, and today I'm going to speak about the history of the Bay-Waveland Yacht Club. I am not a sailor, but sailors are dear to my heart. And so today I'm going to try to give you 120 years of history in 25 minutes about a yacht club that we have had here in Bay St. Louis and Waveland for a long time. To appreciate the beginning of our yacht club, you have to go back to the gay 90s. And the gay 90s here in Bay St. Louis was a lovely time. And there were no interstates. People came and went by horse-drawn cart or sailing boats or a train. And so the trains came here in around 1872, and people from New Orleans started to come here for vacations and weekends and summertime. And in that time frame, about 1885, the town of Waveland evolved or was created because so many people from New Orleans came there and had camps and beach homes. And so in Bay St. Louis, the end of Washington Street was the commercial center of town up until when the railroads came through, and then the depot area became a hot commercial area. So if you belong to a well-to-do family from New Orleans, or a not so well-to-do family, you might come here on the train and get off at the two stops in Waveland, or come all the way into Bay St. Louis, and you would be greeted by 20 or 30 of what they called hacks. These were a small cart motored by a horse, and this was your cab. And then the hack would take you and your luggage over to the Crescent Hotel. And the Crescent Hotel was a magnificent, lovely hotel that was located right where now the corner of Court Street and Front Street, or Beach Boulevard, was. And you would have a lovely vacation, and you would get the pleasure of the sea breezes, and you might sail for fun. Some people fish for fun, but I think most of the fishing was commercial. But anyway, that was life here in the summer. And the people who lived here, either full-time or part-time, they had sailing parties, and they loved to go out. They had boats that were called sloops or schooners. A sloop has one mast, a schooner has two masts. The sloop might be a little more for recreation and racing. The schooner would be the kind of thing you might haul freight in, or go from your dock or pier in front of your beach house to New Orleans or up and down the coast. Remember, there's no highway and there was no ferry, only the train. But the train was like a commuter train, so you could use it to go up and down the coast. Now, to give you an idea, in 1890, the population in Hancock County was about 8,000, and by 1900, it had increased to 11,000. And maybe 3,000 or 4,000 of those people lived in Bay St. Louis and Waveland. There was still a vibrant commercial activity on the Pearl River with all of the timber factories. So anyway, a group of Waveland sailors in 1891 said, we need to have a yacht club. Now, the Southern Yacht Club had been around for 50 years, except they were over in Pass Christian. They weren't on Lake Pontchartrain. But around the turn of the century, they did go to New Orleans. So sailors said, let's have a yacht club. And in about 5 years, they were able in 1896 to put together a project. And the sailors from Bay St. Louis and the sailors from Waveland got together and they started the enterprise called the Bay-Waveland Yacht Club. And they got together enough money to build a yacht club. So we start the Bay-Waveland Yacht Club in 1896. And in a year, we build this grand building that was declared to be, by the Seacoast Echo, the most handsome, well-equipped, and prettiest clubhouse in the South. And the first Commodore was T.F. Richardson. It was a successful yacht club. Yachting had been going on in Bay St. Louis for some time now. For example, I noticed a newspaper report that said after the Civil War in the 1870s, there would be in Bay St. Louis races every Saturday and every Sunday during the summer. 5 or 6 races. That's a lot of races. Now, these were more informal races, and they represented right from early times that Bay St. Louis was a fishing village with a lot of sailors, and sailors loved a race. Trust me, I know. My wife, who is a racing sailor, is in the back of the room where I get a lot of my information. So anyway, to give you an idea of how successful the club was in the beginning, in 1901, they had 600 members. Now, we have about 550 now, and we're happy to have 550. And thanks to the New Orleans people who've been coming over in droves in the last few years, our yacht clubs, both us and the Pass Yacht Club, are seeing our membership expand. But they had 600 in 1901. They paid dues of $6 a year. Not bad. But $6 went a lot further in those days than they do these days. So, we're off to a great start. We've got a great yacht club. And the various yacht clubs began to think, we need to organize these races. You know, it was catch as catch can, and let's go out tomorrow and have a race. And so the various sailors, and people often belong to the Southern Yacht Club and our yacht club at the same time. So there was a camaraderie among the sailors. But to have a regatta, you got to have the boats there. You got to bring them from one yacht club to another. And you've got to have a time. It's got to be organized. So the various yacht clubs got together and they made in 1901 what they call the Southern Gulf Coast Yachting Association. You may have heard of the Gulf Yachting Association. Well, this was a precursor to that organization. And they organized races. And the races would occur at a certain time. And they would get a schedule at the beginning of the year, of the sailing year. And then the yachtsmen could anticipate what's going to happen, what races do I want to go into, and then get my boat to that yacht club for that event. And that began to make the sailing program better and more organized. And it increased the sport of yachting. Remember, in those days, there was no TV, there was no air conditioning. It was better to be out in a boat on the water with those ocean breezes than it was to be sitting in there in your house. So sailing was a lot more popular. People were sailing out on the water all the time. And these organizations were good for the sport of sailing. Now, one of the problems with the sport of sailing was that a lot of the sailors had big, expensive yachts. And it was looked to be a sport for kings, not for everyday people. And so this Southern Gulf Coast Yachting Association decided, let's make this a sport for everyday people. And let's make it more attractive. Now, how do you do that? Well, the first thing you do is you make the boats that you're sailing small boats, the sloops with one mast instead of these big yachts. And what's called a one design enterprise or race, at least the size of the boats was the answer. So more people could get into these races and have boats. They might be their boats that they have for fun, but it was encouraged to have the boats be the small ones rather than the big ones. The second thing they did was to have what's called a winter series. So instead of just in the summer, extend the sailing season from the spring all the way to the fall. More races, more sailing, more fun. And it worked. So things are going great. So what happens when things are going great? You have a yellow fever epidemic and nobody wants to come to the Gulf Coast. So unfortunately, by 1913, this Gulf Coast Yachting Association did not last much longer, and the sailing kind of went down on the coast. Well, you say things couldn't get worse? They did get worse. In 1915, one of the worst hurricanes that ever hit the Gulf Coast hit it and wiped out the club and wiped out the one in Biloxi. Now, the sailing organization we'll call the Bay-Waveland Yacht Club loses interest, no club, and it dies. So now we're getting up to 1921, and a few hardy sailors, of which there are in this town, in every generation. Most of them have the names like Charles Breath or variations of that. But they said, we've got to get this club going back together again. So they organized the second Bay-Waveland Yacht Club. This is a building at the corner of Washington Street and Front Street, which is now called Beach Boulevard. It's a brick building. It wasn't built to be a yacht club. It was to be a general store for a man named Argus Keller. He painted it blue, and it was called the Blue Store. But anyway, I guess he got wiped out in the hurricane, but the building did not. So the second Bay-Waveland Yacht Club, which called itself the Bay-Waveland Yacht and Athletic Club, was organized. Well, that did not last long either. And after a couple years, it died, and the membership shrank to nothing. The good thing, though, in this time frame was that the Gulf Yachting Association was organized. That, you remember, the precursor was the association that had started in 1901. And that organization has been very successful and has lasted 100 years. And that is our parent organization for the whole Gulf Coast. So anyway, there was sailing by some of the local sailors. Effort was made by 1930 to resurrect some of this sailing spirit. And part of sailing is partying, too. It's not just about sailing. So a man named Charles Breath Sr. bought the building and started to throw parties there. And they were very successful. And so he said, let's call it Uncle Charlie's Nightclub. And they did. The sailors all put together an informal group of sailors called the Windjammers Yacht Club. And so we had some sailing, and it was not part of the Gulf Yachting Association, but these sailors were keeping things alive. Sailors like John McDonnell and Charles Breath and his family. And unfortunately, the Depression came along, and World War II came along, and the sailing programs, organized sailing programs, did decline. But the Gulf Yachting Association was very successful in many ways, and one of the things that they did was in 1919, one of their members, Rathbone Du Bois, decided we need to build a boat that everyday people can use. A boat that will be easy to rig the sails and be manageable. And the club has to own the boats. And we'll get 6 of these boats, and we'll offer them to the membership, and they can race with them or recreational sail with them, and it can be something that people can afford, that is the rental, and it'll be something that can be managed. Well, this boat he built and invented, he was an architect, was called the fish boat, or the fish class sailboat, but everybody calls it the fish boat. And they didn't like that at first because they said, this sounds like something smelly that people go out and fish and shrimp with. But it hung on. So this is a rendition by my next door neighbor, Barbara Brockman, who this is hanging up in the Bay-Waveland Yacht Club. And this boat was a sloop, so it has one mast. It has something called gaff rig, and that is this kind of 4-sided sail. And it was made of wood, and it had a keel that was wooden and permanent. It was the most popular sailboat in the 20th century. And it was the GYA boat, that's Gulf Yachting Association, for 50 years. And it was loved by all. Everyday people could use it. And by the 1950s, when sailing reemerged as a popular sport, people were sailing in these boats. A lot of people in Bay St. Louis owned their own boats. Another small boat was Lightning, was popular, but the yacht clubs would have 6, and the Southern Yacht Club set the example by having 6 of them built. Now, you might wonder, where did they get this name fish boat? They don't fish in these things. Well, that's because Commodore Du Bois named his 6 boats the Porpoise, the Minnow, the tarpon, the pompano, the mackerel, and the shark. So naturally, they got the nickname the fish boats. But they were very popular. Then the GYA said, okay, let's have every club in the Gulf Yachting Association have half dozen fish boats. And when we race with one design, the fish boat. And then the sailors, it isn't a matter of how good your boat is, how fast it is, how many sails are on it. It's all about how well can you sail, or as the expression goes, trim your sails to the prevailing winds. And yet you can have two boats with two skilled crews of sailors, and yet one set of sailors, if they are more experienced, will always win. Same wind, same direction, same time. So it really does matter how you trim your sails to the prevailing winds. So the Gulf Yachting Association set up these one design regattas. And again, this was making the sport of sailing very attractive, and the sport was robust, not only on the Gulf Coast, but all over the country. And sailing was growing and getting better. The next slide is the boat that replaced it. And this is a boat with the name Flying Scot. And this boat replaced the fish boat in something like 1969. So that fish boat lasted from 1919 to 1969. But sailors were beginning to read magazines like Sailing World, and they were saying, we want a sexier boat than that old wooden fish boat. So they came up with this design, and it had a few things that were attractive. One was that it had the traditional mainsail and jib, single mast, and it had a retractable center board, which is the same as the keel, except that you could pull that up. Then you can take this boat and put it on a trailer and go everywhere very more conveniently than you could with the boat that has the fixed large keel. The other thing that set this really apart from the fish boat is the spinnaker. Now, you've probably looked at pictures of races and you've seen this big sail that floats out in front of the other sailing platform. That is the spinnaker. And you use that usually on the downwind runs. And that gives you great speed. But there is an art to getting it out, which is called setting the spinnaker. And then you got to put it up just as you're rounding the mark to go for the downhill last run. And you got to do it better than the next boat. And seconds can make a difference of feet in terms of the power of your boat, how much wind there is, and if you're going to win. And if you have the lead, whether you keep the lead. So the spinnaker was attractive. Then you have to take it down when you get into upwind and you're tacking, and that's called deucing the spinnaker. Well, the difference between the Flying Scot and the fish boat was enough that a lot of the old timers, they didn't want to deal with this. And they found it a pain. So we had at the Bay-Waveland Yacht Club, the new one had started now in 1949. We had Flying Scots. And in the 1970s, a group of young teenagers learned how to use the spinnaker and the Flying Scot boat and got good at it. I mean, they got really good at it. And at this time, two of our Commodores, Harry Chapman and Walter Chamberlain, were encouraging the young sailors, let's go to national races. Now in the 60s, we started going to the local races, or the ones in the GYA called the Liptons. And in the beginning, we weren't doing so good. We went through the 50s and the early 60s without winning the Lipton. But by 1963, we started winning the Liptons. Well, the Liptons is the premier regatta of the sailing season on the Gulf Coast. And that is the regatta that determines who are the best sailors on the Gulf Coast. And it took us a while to get there. But we finally started winning the Lipton, which is the race within the Gulf Yachting Association. But these teenagers were better than that. And they said, with the encouragement of Walter Chamberlain and Harry and the rest of the yacht club and their parents, let's go to the nationals. Let's see how sailors from other parts of the country sail compared to us. Well, these kids were so good, they won the nationals. Nationals were called the Mallory, for example. And the women's was Adams. But there was a group of sailors, champion sailors. The Egan boys, Buddy and Mark, you've heard of them, I know. Judy Reeves won 1977, the Adams. The Stifle family, Cindy, Rod, and Dennis. Corky Hayden, and Amy Chaplin. And all of a sudden, now the Bay-Waveland Yacht Club was on the national scene and a contender for national regattas and championships. The sailing program had evolved from an amateurish type of catch Ken on a Sunday afternoon to the big leagues. Now, I'll briefly mention the last sailboat, which came along around 2019. Next sail. And this is, can you go back?
Sorry, guys.
Yeah. This is called the Viper 640. There you see the big spinnaker. And you see the racing sailboat style, what's called the open transom, which is the stern or back of the boat. And this is the latest one that we have incorporated and have become champions in also. But that's another story for another time. Now I want to, the next picture is briefly show you, these are the three boats that are out in front of the yacht club. And this is the fish boat with that big keel and rudder that are made out of wood. This is the Flying Scot with the centerboard. And this is the Viper 640 with the back absent, called a absent tramson. Anyway, next slide. This is a painting of John Bell Jr. He was our first Commodore, and he was Commodore in 1949 and 1950. He was followed by Robert Camus, who is the uncle of Chris Roth, and he served for 2 years. And they built the club, got it started, and next slide. This is the yacht club in 1949, and it's a painting, and it was built pretty much by John Bell. At least he was the, you might say, contractor, or supervised a bunch of workers and got it built. And most important, got a group of sailors to contribute the money to build the yacht club. But it got built, and it was a big success. Next slide. This is the yacht club from the air, obviously. And you can see the harbor had a few boats in it, but it wasn't as robust a harbor or marina that it is now. You can see that it's on a peninsula here that was part of the Peerless Oyster Cannery factory back in the day. And this is Ron Thorpe's playground. But that was before Ron Thorpe came and developed the property. So another event that's important is, next slide, about 1995, Corky Hayden and Henry Martinez, Commodore Martinez, decided that these yacht clubs have a dual mission. They're sailing clubs, and that's important, but they're also country clubs. And that the membership, most of them don't sail, but in a town like Bay St. Louis, you want to have a place where people can go and have fun. Now, sailors have no trouble organizing parties, and they party hardy. But they have children, and we needed to have something where kids could hang out there and have fun. And worst, Past Christian Yacht Club got a swimming pool, so doggone, we had to get one too. So Henry and Corky raised the money, and here is the swimming pool. So things were going good. And of course, when things are going good, and down here on the Gulf Coast, a hurricane comes. So the next hurricane was, unhappily, Katrina. And let me have the next slide. The yacht club was destroyed. And so the sailors in town, as well as some of the boosters, got together and raised the money and built Bay-Waveland Yacht Club number 4. This is an artist's rendition. The architecture is slightly different from how it finally got done, but it did get done, and we have a great clubhouse. And the club is doing well. We have 550 members, and there's sailing activity, a women's auxiliary that's robust, sailing camp in the summer, lots to do. And we are lucky in Hancock County to have these kind of organizations because it's part of our cultural heritage. The love of the sea, the water, the skill of sailing, and fishing. And the yacht club, happily I can say, is enjoying good health. Let's hope no more hurricanes. So the last picture is what I call a big boat. This is called a J-boat. The name of the J-boat is the Eagle. Now, as I told you, we at the Bay-Waveland Yacht Club have pretty much been on what I call the little boats. And the little boats are the ones that I've shown you over the years that we've used and replaced, so that we are now with the Viper 480, the world's champion. Twice, 2 years in a row. So the decision in 1949 to go to the peninsula where the Peerless Oyster Factory was a key decision because it put our sailing races on Bay St. Louis. That meant that all we have is little boats. We don't have these big boats that need a crew of 6 and 7, depending on how hard the wind is blowing. And we became good with these little boats, particularly when they changed the architecture and the other sailors all over the country don't have the time to get the skills ahead of time like we do. But whatever works in the sailing game. So anyway, this is a larger sloop. It's got one mast. It's called a J-boat. And the skipper back here is my wife, Patty.
Jim, thank you very much. Very good. I know a number of us here, excuse me.
Yeah, Jim,
Yes.
the first yacht club, where was it physically located?
At the end of Washington Street. I should have mentioned that. It had a long pier going out to it, and this is probably a bit of a compromise between the Waveland sailors and the, but a lot of the racing was done out in the Sound. It was more recreational sailing in the bay, particularly for the younger sailors and the ones who didn't want to deal with the waves and the currents that are out in the Sound. But the first one, they wanted out on the Sound. The end of Washington Street was a center of Bay St. Louis at the time, and that was where they thought was the best place. Just like Pass Christian Yacht Club is right there on the Sound also. Yes?
Want to mention about August Keller's store and the history of the building, or you want to go into that?
I don't know enough. It was called the Blue Store. It was a general store that had a lot of stuff. It was very successful.
And then it was bought by Orty and became the Orty Theater. And then it was bought by John Graffiti and became the Star Theater. And then when he closed, it became Big E.
Yeah.
So if everybody remembers all that, and then of course it was lost to Katrina.
Good story, yes.
Where were the fish boats built?
They were built in New Orleans. This Rathburn Du Bois, if we got the name right, he built them there in New Orleans, and it originally was for the Southern Yacht Club. But they worked so good that the rest of the yacht clubs on the Gulf Coast embraced and adopted that as their one design boat for all races. And you can see it lasted for almost 50 years, and it was considered the most popular sailing boat on the Gulf Coast in the 20th century.
If I can supplement that, the John McDonald right here on 2nd Street, Toomey. They built some of them right there. In the McDonald Lumber Company as well. So.
Yes.
I think you should include information about the Double Wide Yacht Club after Katrina. The resilience of the people to party. That was a very fun time to be in the yacht club. They had 2 big trailers with a deck in between, and it kept the spirit of the people going to build what they have now. And you should include that in the history of the yacht club.
That's a good suggestion.
We had the best parties in this little tiny space, and some people might have photos of it. I mean, you never think to take a photo of being in a place like that, but it was very much.
We will. I joined this yacht club in something like 2006, and
you were part of that.
I was part of that, and I remember Yvonne Jelpy came up right as soon as we walked in the door and bought us a drink, and welcomed us. There was a lot of other sailors, and you could get the feel that this club is going to come back. This town and the Gulf Coast in general does come back every time we get hit by a hurricane. And if we get hit again, we'll come back.
On that end, when the Cotton Yacht Club got destroyed, and Henry, and you can correct me on this if I'm wrong, a whole group of the members got together and each of them put up $10,000 of their own money and to help get us to the point where we could build that beautiful building that we have. And then as the money came in from the dues and the bar and the bar and the bar, they all got their money back in something like 4 years or.
It was sort of like a bond issue.
Yeah.
And then the bonds were redeemed.
Rapidly.
Yeah, I think 4 years or so. I don't remember
Yeah,
exactly
it
how
was a very
long.
short time. I mean, there was
Yeah.
a lot of booze that went over there.
I want to piggyback on what Miss Liz said just a little while ago. When Yacht Club number 3 was demolished, destroyed in Katrina, those 2 trailers went up, and the Rotary Club here in town immediately went into those trailers for their Wednesday lunchtime meeting. And I remember we had a couple of end-of-year parties on that deck in between those 2 trailers. And I remember one time we had a band playing, and the sound was so horrible because everything bounced off those 2 metal walls, going back at everybody. But it was great memories, that kind of stuff. But yeah, the Rotary Club was back in those trailers as soon as they got put up. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of good times and a lot of reminiscence about the yacht club and how it came to be what it is today. So, Jim, thank you. And just a couple of brief announcements. One, I want to thank Eddie Coleman